Shalom, shalom. First and foremost, giving all praises, honor, glory, and worship to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, Bahashim Machakodash, double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, greetings and salutations to Yakim upon the testimony of our Lord and Savior Yahushai in truth and sincerity. This will be a brief overview of Daniel, the 8th chapter, not in detail, but regarding edification. I hope to hit the points that's necessary. This is Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, which Belshazzar was the king of Babylon of that time period, coming from the Nepo dynasty. I believe the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, if I'm not mistaken. And it said, and I believe that's, if I'm not mistaken, 539 BC. 539 BC. Which this was the last year of the reign of the Nepo dynasty, or the Babylonian dynasty, which regarded the lineage of Nebuchadnezzar. And this was the year, essentially, in the last final king before the transition to the Persian Achaemenid Empire having dominion and rulership. So the vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw, that I was in Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Now, when we see the term Shushan, Shushan is otherwise known as Susa, all right? Which you read about Esther being in Susa. And the palace, it was actually the palace at this time period. It was a palace for the Babylonians, for the Nepo dynasty. But later it was highly regarded, especially because those who actually were native to that landmass, the Persians, the Iranians, it was considered the winter house for the king of the Achaemenid Empire. And it says, which is in the province of Elam, which Elam is speaking of India. Iran, Pakistan, all of that is essentially, those are the people of Elam. It's not speaking of India, it's actually speaking of Iran. It's speaking of, then these people are of the same stock and descent. They all descend from Elam. And it says it was by the river of Ulai. Let's get a visual, quick visual. So this is Susa, or Shushan, and the river Ulai is the Chaospis River that you see here, in which this is located in modern Iran. This is Susa, which you can see is in western Iran, bordering Iraq and the Tigris and the Euphrates. And I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And that ram was a representation of both the Persian, the Medes and the Persians. All right, which we know in history as the Medo-Persian Empire. It says, and the 2 horns were high. They were high because they ruled the Fertile Crescent. They ruled the Levant. They were at the top of the earth in their time period. They were the rulers. They were those guys at that period. It says, but one was higher than the other, which the Persians began to be greater and have more of a heightened dominion than the Medes, which that's what we have the birth of the Achaemenid Empire, Cambyses conquering Egypt, those 3 ribs being in the mouth, and devour much flesh, as the prophecy says also in other parts of Daniel. That's speaking of the Persians. It says, but one was higher than the other, which the Persians were higher than the Medes, and the higher came up last, right? Because originally, the Medes, it was the Medes rulership. Originally, which Darius was of the Medes, if I'm not mistaken. Let's go to this next chapter. Daniel chapter 9. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes. See, so originally it says, which was made king over the rim of the Chaldeans, which they overcame the Babylonian Empire via a surgical strike. Darius, he came from the seed of the Medes, but we know from the line of the Achaemenids, when Cambyses conquered Egypt, so on and so forth, the Achaemenid Empire, essentially, which were of the Persian descent, were the ones to come up and be greater than the Medes. That's why I said, and the higher came up last. Originally, it was the Medes, then the Persians got preeminence. And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. Well, why didn't they say eastward? Well, because the ram came from the east. And they didn't push into India. They pushed to the Fertile Crescent. In Iran, Iraq, they pushed into Egypt. Was, as I spoke earlier, Cambyses' campaign into Montezarium, into Egypt. They pushed into Lydia. Or they conquered Lydia. They conquered Babylon, as we know. And those are the three ribs, by the way. And that's why I said east. That's why it says, well, I'm going to directly quote it again. It says pushing westward and northward and southward. Now, when we go to a map, let's go back to the, let's see here. So the Achaemenid dynasty came from this landmass where you see called Elam, which this is modern day Iran or Persia. Now, what they did is they pushed westward, which is in Babylonia. They pushed into Egypt, which is westward, northward, which is Babylonia, Assyria, and southward, which is the land of Sumer, essentially the other side of the Persian Gulf. You know, the Arabian Peninsula, things of that magnitude and proximity. It says, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. Right. Nobody militarily could overcome the Achaemenid Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty. Of course, until Alexander, that goat, that notable one. I continue on and says, but he did according to his will and became great. Yes, the Achaemenid Empire was essentially, at that time period, the greatest and the most expansive empire that the earth had ever seen, period. So yeah, that is great. It had over 120 provinces. Essentially over 120 states, if I may. So it's very powerful, very influential, very rich and abundant. Verse 5. It says, and as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west. And who is that he-goat? That he-goat is speaking of Alexander the Great. And he was great. Don't let anybody ever tell you he wasn't great. He was a great Edomite, fulfilling a blessing in which Isaac gave him. And that blessing was great. It was a blessing for him to have the fatness of the earth. And Alexander was a key constituent in manifesting that blessing. It says his feet didn't touch the ground. Oh, it actually says in this verse. I'm going to continue. It said, and the he-goat came from the west. And where is the west? The west is speaking of Macedonia. Let's see. Let's get a map. Let's get a good map. That's the Silas. Okay. All right. So this is a map, right? So we're going to go to it. It's kind of, I want a more clear map if I can. So come on now. Let's go. Let's load up. Pardon me. It's taking a while to load. Look at this empire, this man. All right. So here you see Macedonia. Macedonia is where Alexander came from, which this, from geographically speaking, this is the west see, when we're talking about the empire and the rulership, we're talking Fertile Crescent. We're talking Fertile Crescent. This is the Fertile Crescent. We're talking the Middle East. All right. And why did nobody conquer Arabia? Because nobody wants a desert. So Alexander, he came from Hellespont. He came from Macedonia, and he came from Greece, from the west. And let's see what that Higo did. Let's continue to read. The Higo came from the west on the face, and Higo came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes, which the he-goat, it was representation of the Macedonian Empire, of the Greek infrastructure, and the notable horn is none other but Alexander the Great, Alexander the Greek. Some will call him the freak, but for edification, say we indeed can say Alexander the Great, because he was great. We can't take that away from him. He was anointed. He was even the high priest of Israel. Legitimize his reign, legitimize his position in prophecy. He is great. America's great. Babylon's great. You understand? And what he did was unprecedented. And this is actually biblical prophecy. Verse 6, it says, and he came to the ram, which came to the Persian Medes Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire. It says, we could talk Battle of Thermopylae. We could talk, we could talk Battle of Issus. It says, and he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him unto him in the fury of his power. And that's the Greek expedition into the Persian Empire against, I believe it was, what was it? Darius. See here. So you see, this is what he did. He came from Macedonia and he conquered the Persian Empire. He conquered all of this landmass, all the way to Bactria, all the way to the land of Elam, which we see Elam. Ooh, and that's perfect. You see this term Carmenia. Now, in the book of the Apocryphas, it says the Carmenians should come out in wrath, which that's speaking of the Persians. And we see Carmenia right here. And we see India, which India is speaking of the land of Elam. India Inferior, which is South India, and India Superior, which is North India. Now, we know India today has been that landmass east of that. But India, or essentially, which some will call it Hindustan, but India essentially is Elam. We're talking Elam. When we want to talk biblical proportions, let's talk Elam. They are descendants of Elam. The Persians are descendants of Elam. Now, let me see here. I don't want to... Let's see here. This is a good map. Matter of fact, I'm saving this map. Save, absolutely. So, let's see. Afghanistan, we're talking Elam. Let's see. Iran, we're talking Elam. See, now the defining battle, as I just mentioned, was the Battle of Issus, 333 BC. Conflict early in Alexander's great invasion of Asia, in which he defeated the Persian army under King Darius III. Now, we read earlier Darius in Daniel the 9th chapter, the top of Daniel the 9th chapter. That was Darius of the seed of the Medes. That was a different Darius. That wasn't Darius III. That was That was a different Darius. The Darius the third came from the Persian line, not the Maccabees line. He didn't come from Medea. He came from the Persian Achaemenid line. Continue. Says this was the fight. This was the decisive victory by which Alexander conquered the Achaemenid Empire. See, that's what it says. And this is, matter of fact, let me go to the Apocrypha. Let's go to the Bible and get this history. Because all this history is in the Bible. Let's go to the book of... No, I think it's the book of Second. Is it Second? Nope. It's the book of First Maccabees, pardon me. We're going to get some history on Alexander in the Bible. All right, this is First Maccabees chapter 1. Pardon me. First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 1. And this is a part of the reason why these books were taken out of the Bible. These are canon books that were taken out of the Bible. They were taken out of the Bible. But this is legitimate history. Nobody can argue with this history. Why did they take it out? Well, maybe because it's legitimate. Maybe because maybe it was that piece of the puzzle that they couldn't just, they had to remove it so the picture wouldn't be as clear and vivid as the prophets and the men of the Lord are displaying it today. Well, maybe that's why. This is the book of First Maccabees. Ooh, the secret counsel of the wicked. That's a spirit. GMS get this work. And that was and it's 144. And it's 1144. And that is the spirit. You understand? 44% on the iPad. You understand? First Maccabees, the first chapter. Beautiful. So I'm going to continue on. This is First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 1. And it happened after Alexander, son of Philip, which this is the Alexander in which we were speaking of, which that's the notable horn of the goat, of the he-goat. It says, the Macedonian who came out of the land of Kittim, which Alexander's line came from Kittim, which Kittim is speaking of Cyprus, Cathaim, all right, bruisers is essentially what it means in Hebrew. But originally his line came from Edom, but they migrated into the land of Kittim eventually, and from Kittim they migrated to Macedonia. All right, it said, had smitten Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, that he reigned in his stead the first over Greece. Right. He reigned in his stead the first over the Macedonian Empire. And he was that was the first Edomites to rule over Greece. Philip, his father, and then Alexander. Because the Greeks, from a genetic perspective, the original Greeks, Yawan, they're Japhites. Now, the Greeks, they were composed of Japhites. That's the original Greeks. But when you talk about, for instance, let's talk about the Spartans. The Spartans were actually Israelites that migrated to that landmass. Oftentimes, history considers them as Greeks, which they were Greeks. They were Hellenistic in that sense. But from a bloodline genetic perspective, they were Israelites, the Spartans. And I believe it's the Laodiceans. That's actually in the Apocrypha. Laodiceans. I might be misspelling it. Yeah, I'm misspelling it. Let me hold up. Let me see here. Because it's actually in the Apocrypha. Give me 1 second. I don't mean to take too long on this, but when we start getting into history, that's my passion. And I'm trying to sharpen myself as well. Let's see. I believe it's... let me see. This is what I'm about to do. I know how to find it right here. I'm about to find it. Not Laodiceans. See, this is why we got to go over this stuff. Lacedaemonians. Those were the Spartans, which those came from the stock of Jacob. And as we see, we're going to read here to a letter in which the Israelites of Jerusalem wrote to the Spartans in this time period. First Maccabees chapter 12. We'll start at verse 19. It said, and this is the copy of the letters which Honorius sent. Arius, king of Lacedaemonians, which those are the Spartans. That's speaking of the Spartans. To Onias the high priest, greetings. It is found in writing that the Lacedaemonians are Jews are brethren. It says right here that in records that they were brethren. They weren't the people of the Lacedaemonians were not ethnic Greeks. Just like Alexander was an ethnic Greek. It just said he came from Kittim. He wasn't an ethnic Greek, in which he originally came from Edom, because Alexander was an Edomite. All right, but the Lacedaemonians, which are the Spartans, they are Israelites. That's why we read here it says, "And the Jews are brethren." They're brethren. It says, "And they are of the stock of Abraham." It just says that right here, that they are the stock of Abraham. Now, the people who originally are inhabitants of that landmass of Yawan, they were not of the stock of Abraham. They were of the stock of Japheth. They were Japhetic people. They were not Shemitic people. All right, let's go back to chapter 1. Oversteer. Let's go. Let me see. I believe I might have touched the point on that. Let me make sure. Let's go back. I don't want to get too deep into that regard. But it's history. You got to be careful. You start going into history, you'll be. You start going into history, you'll be talking for hours upon hours. It's just so deep. That's actually what history means, to dig up, to dig out. But let's see here. All right, Daniel chapter 8, verse 7. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he moved with choler against him, which this is what the Grecian Empire did, or the Hellenistic campaign against the Achaemenid Empire. They moved with choler. Now let's get that word choler. And what was right here. I want to get that word in the Hebrew. Choler. Marar, which is going into being bitterness. Which the context, Wayatha Maramar. Or Wayatha Marara, to be bitter. He moved with bitterness. And why did he move? Ooh, that's perfect. Now, why did he move with bitterness? Because Alexander was upset at the Persian campaigns against Greece 100 years prior to. He was mad that they burnt down the temple of the Greek gods, and they burned down Athens, if I'm not mistaken, and he wanted vengeance. He wanted retribution. And that's what they did. And they burnt down the capital. I believe Susa, if I'm not mistaken, was actually burnt down by the Greeks. They burned down. I'm talking about a magnificent city of the ancient world. One of the top cities in which the world has ever seen, especially from an ancient world perspective. And what did Alexander do? He burned it down. Why? Because he moved with bitterness. Why would you burn that? I mean, just the infrastructure that they had, he could have used that. That could have been to his benefit. Why would that wasn't an intelligent decision? Well, maybe because he moved in bitterness. Okay, the Bible was right. Again, there we go. That makes sense. That makes sense. Let's see here. It says choler against him and smote the ram. which the ram is the Persians, and brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. It was we just spoke about the battle of Issus. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Nope, and that's why the king of Arabia beheaded Darius III and gave it to Alexander, which Alexander was he was upset at that, if I'm not mistaken. But nevertheless, that's what took place. It says verse 8. It says, therefore, well, pretended to be upset, I'll say that. Verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, which that's talking about the Greeks. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and that's the death of Alexander the Great. Let's go back to the Apocrypha books and get that. Which horn represents strength. Verse 5. And after these, let's go to verse 4. And he gathered a mighty strong host and ruled over countries and nations and kings who became tributaries unto him, which is speaking of Alexander. Verse 5. And after these things he fell sick and perceived that he should die. Wherefore he called his servants, such as were honorable and had been brought up with him from his youth, and parted his kingdom among them while he was yet alive. So Alexander reigned 12 years and then died. Biblical prophecy. And meanwhile, this prophecy in Daniel was written hundreds of years before what was written in the book of Maccabees, or before that action even happened. By the time it came to the Maccabees, that was history. During the time of Daniel, it was prophecy. Let's see here. It says, and the great horn was broken, which is the death of Alexander the Great. That's why it says the great horn was broken, because he was great. He was a devil. He was a devil. Yeah, he was a demon. Yeah, he was an Edomite, but he was great. He was. We can't take that. Give it to him. Come on. We about to get the kingdom of heaven. I can just give it to him. Let him have that. It says, and it came to pass, pardon me. And for it came up 4 notable ones. I'm going to read it again. And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven, which we just read about Alexander pardoning his kingdom to those who came up amongst him, which the notable ones were speaking of his generals. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, as High Priest Ariel said, or Lysimachus, and Cassander. Those were the 4 notable horns. Those are the 4 notable ones. And they ruled over their respective portions of Alexander's kingdom. I believe Cassander ruling over Macedonia. Lysimachus ruling over Hellespont and the waterways and the trade ports of Hellespont. Ptolemy ruling over Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucids ruling over the Levant region, the Levant, Syria, the Levant in Syria. Verse 9, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which the Seleucid Empire, out of all of those empires and dynasties, was the most powerful and influential. First and foremost, more so from a military perspective and power and jurisdiction perspective. Now, if you want to talk about religious and philosophical, well, we have to speak of the Ptolemaic. They were more dominant in that aspect. But from a military, terrestrial possession, landmass possession, that will go to the Seleucid Empire. That will go to and that little horn is speaking of Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which waxed, and I'm gonna continue to read, which waxed exceeding great, because he was on the road. He took his campaign down to Egypt in the Syrian War, the Diocletian Wars, And essentially he was about to conquer Egypt, but because Rome stepped in and intervened on behalf of Egypt, he was forced. That's where you get the term "draw the line in the sand." He was forced to leave Egypt. It says, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south, which that was talking about Egypt and his campaign against the Egyptian Empire. I got to watch that. The value of the Lord's name is about the. Yeah, I got to watch that. Let's see here. Let me get through this. It says, toward the south and toward the east, because he did conquer. You do want to talk about Bactria. You want to talk about those different provinces towards the east, in the Middle East, and that platform. He conquered that landmass, Iraq. All right, that was in his possession. It says, and toward the pleasant land. The pleasant land is speaking of Jerusalem. He did conquer and have jurisdiction over Jerusalem in the land of Israel. Verse 10, and it waxed great, even the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground. That's talking about when he slaughtered Israelites after his campaign in Egypt. Because there was a revolt. There was a rumor that Antiochus had died and perished. So Jason, I believe it was Jason, he was a demon himself, but he was the high priest at that time period. And they revolted against Antiochus, and he came back to Jerusalem, and he put a lot of Israelites to death. He killed and slaughtered Israelites. It says, and stamped upon them. And that was in the pleasant land, which is Jerusalem, Israel. Verse 11, yet he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And that's talking about the defilement of the temple, the desolation of the temple, which the Greeks did. Let's see. I'm going to read verse 63. First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 63. Wherefore the rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meats, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. So then they died. And that's a part of Antiochus stumping down the Israelites. As it said, what does it say? How did they word it? It says, it said, and stamped upon them, which he was killing Israelites. Now let's go. And there was a great wrath upon Israel. Let's see. Let me see. Excuse me. I'm trying to go fast with this because I don't want to take too long. I'm trying to go through it. Thank goodness sake. I'm trying to get the points that I need. And this is the defilement of the temple that we were reading about. First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 44. And it reads, it says, for the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbath and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, and that they should leave their children uncircumcised. And remember, the children are a representation of the temple as well. And that they should leave their children uncircumcised, and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, to the end that they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. Right? It says, and whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. And they were killing us and they were persecuting us because we wanted to keep the ways of our ancestors and keep the ways of Moses and our forefathers and keep the ways of the Bible. And Antiochus, that demon, that Edomite, that so-called white man, piece of shit. Goddamn devil. It says, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols and sacrifice swine's flesh. All right, now let's go back to what we're reading in Daniel's so you can see how it correlates. Yeah, he magnified himself, which is Antiochus the Fourth, even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And the host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So we just read that in Maccabees, what I was talking about. Verse 13, and I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto the certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And that's speaking of the time period, roughly from, if I'm not mistaken, speaking of the original campaign time period of Antiochus into Egypt, in his destruction of Jerusalem when he came back from his campaign, all the way to the liberation of the temple and the rededication of the temple, which you call Hanukkah today. That's the origin of Hanukkah. Let's see here. Let me go to that. Let's see here. Yep. So essentially from what you would consider 170 BC, which is when Onias murdered through the machinations of Menelaus, which you can read that in 2 Maccabees chapter 4, verse 30 and 38. And Antiochus IV initiates the Six Syrian War, which was his campaign that we spoke about, and which the scripture spoke about, of him going towards the south, which is Egypt, south, which he was coming from Syria. Pardon me, I'm reading. And of course, it was, I believe, let me see here. I'm actually looking at some a timeline right now. All right, essentially from that point to 164 BC, which is when Antiochus dies of illness while of successful campaign against Parthia, rededication of the temple under Judas, rededication, of the temple under Judas Maccabee, so that time period. Now, remember that those days are actually literal. So what verse was I at? What was that? Right. So verse 14, it says, 2,300 days. Now, let's see. 2,300 days divided by, let's say, 360 days, right? I believe that's the lunar days for a lunar calendar, which you get essentially about 6.4 years. So 6 years. So that's that time period from 170 BC to 164 BC. And by the way, this prophecy was written before that event even happened, actually hundreds of years before it happened. So yes, indeed, the Bible once again proves itself to be undefeated. Wow. Yep, it definitely does. Let's see here. Verse 15, it came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me an appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of Uli, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. Gabriel being the chief archangel. Which, let's get the term Gabriel, which is Gabar Ya'ala. Gabar meaning warrior, and Allah meaning power. Warrior of God, essentially what it means. All right. Verse 17, and he came near when I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Verse 18, now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. Which he was probably praying. He was probably making supplications. I'm just speaking, because his face was towards the ground. But verse 19, and he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest and 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And the great horn is the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Ooh, that's perfect. We just read that in Maccabees. I never even thought about it like that. It actually says the first over Greece. It says let me see. It's yeah, it says First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 1, in the continuation in the latter part, it says that he reigned in his stead the first over Greece. The first over Greece. And it says right here, verse 21 of Daniel the 8th chapter, and the rough he-goat is the king of Grecia, which is Alexander, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king, which the first king is talking about Alexander. All right, the first king is specifically speaking of Alexander. And it said the first over Greece. And the rough goat is essentially the power structure of the Greek Empire. Verse 21, it says, now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, which was the 4 generals, Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucus. Yeah, that's all of them. It says, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nations, but not in his power. Meaning none of them are going to have the power in which Alexander had of having that full fertile crescent from Macedonia all the way to Afghanistan. None of them will be able to have that type of power. They didn't. Even the Seleucid Empire, they didn't have it. Verse 23, and in the later time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and holy people, which that's talking about Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, with his new world order that he instituted. Verse 25, and we know who he is today, by the way, those of us that are initiated. Verse 25, and through his policy, which that policy, matter of fact, let's go to his policy. Oh, yeah. So this is talking about the Six Syrian War right here. First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 17, showing you that the Bible is real. These people talking about, well, no, you deceive yourself with that one. Verse 17, wherefore he entered into Egypt, that's him waxing towards the south, with a great multitude of chariots and elephants and horsemen and a great navy, and made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. But Ptolemy was afraid of him and fled, and many were wounded to death. Thus they got a strong city in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils thereof. And after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year, which is of the king of the Greeks, of the Grecian rulership. It says, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered proudly into the sanctuary. Showing you how we're talking about in Daniel, the 8th chapter, how they defiled the sanctuary. It says, and took away the golden altar and the candlestick of light and all the vessels thereof, and the table of shewbread, and the pouring vessels, and the veils, and the censers of gold, and the veil, and the crown, and the gold ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. Let me see here. This is verse 24. And when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having made a great massacre. So he massacred us, and spoken very proudly. And he lost at the end. And when he lost bad too. Nigga. Verse 25. Therefore, there was a great mourning in Israel, in every place where they were, so that the princes of the elders mourn. And we just read about in Daniel's, he should exalt himself against the princes of the, the power, essentially, what it said. Let me see here. I think that's all I want on that. Yeah. Oh, no, I wanted to get the policy. My bad. That's what I wanted to get. Let's see here. Right. So First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 41, which this is speaking of the where it says this is speaking of the policy that we just read about in verse 25. This is the policy. This First Maccabees chapter 1, First Maccabees chapter 1, Verse 41, moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom, which is the policy, that all should be one people, which that was a world order of its time period. And everyone should leave his laws, so that so all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. It says, yeah, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. So that was that policy, that demonic policy that, oh yeah, it says, let's see here. It says, yeah, verse 44, it says, for the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem, which is policy, and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and the Sabbaths and festival days. Which that's the policy of verse 25. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. And he was broken when he came up against Yahweh by Shem Yahushai. Verse 26, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. Which that vision already took place. It was prophecy. This is already taking place now. It took place during the time of the Greeks. Verse 27. And I, Daniel, fainted, and I was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So that is an overview of Daniel, the 8th chapter. Lord willing, it was edifying, giving all praises, honor, glory, and worship to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahushai, Bahashim, Chakwadash. Once again, double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone, my teachers in which do well. And salutations to you, Akim. Shalom, keep the faith.